Okay, so just to explain this concept a little bit more, these are three different internal rotation dominant, or I would classify them as internal rotation dominant pitchers. But there's a kind of a misconception that all internal rotation dominant lower halves are kind of using the exact same timing, mechanism, and positions, and that's not the case. So on the left we have Diego Castillo, who I've broken down before, but he is what I would classify as kind of a vertical shin and internal rotation dominant guy, which it's relatively uncommon, but you can see he has kind of that vertical shin position as he gets into his backside. And so if you draw a line from the heel through the patella, that line does not intersect with the hips, with the pelvis. Where you compare that to somebody like Devin Williams, where he gets to this point in his delivery and you draw that line through the heel, from the heel through the knee. It's relatively close to pointing towards that front hip. We look at somebody like Fernando Rodney, and he's really getting into that internal rotation dominant position, where you draw that same line, it's even further than that front hip. And so just an example of three different internal rotation dominant guys. The way that Castillo is able to create that IR load, it's going to be a combination of pelvis and femoral motion to create that IR load. And so Diego kind of sets this vertical shin angle, and he really creates a ton of counter rotation from the pelvis to create that IR load. And so you'll see for him, his belt buckle is facing way back. He's kind of showing his back to the target at this point in his delivery. So he's creating that IR load with a vertical shin. That's kind of his strategy. Somebody like a Fernando Rodney, he's got some counter rotation of the pelvis, but nowhere near as much as Castillo. And he's creating that load more from kind of the femur side of the hip joint. And then Devin Williams is kind of an interesting case, something I wanted to point out. He kind of does the same thing as Fernando Rodney, where he has that early IR. But what he doesn't do as efficiently as a Fernando Rodney is, if you actually watch what happens at the ankle, right about here, that ankle begins to cave early. And so this would be kind of early eversion. So now if we draw a line through the heel, now the heel is pointing all the way down here, but the shin angle is still in this direction. And so he's created a disconnect at the very base of his delivery by kind of caving into early eversion at this point. And so that's just something I wanted to point out. If you look at Fernando Rodney, he's very stable through that ankle joint. And so as the angle of his shin changes, you're going to see that the angle of the ankle matches it. Whereas in Devin Williams, you see kind of that early IR, that early caving. Ideally, you don't want to see that eversion happening until the very last second as the back foot starts to turn over into landing. You can see that in Castillo right here. At that very last second, as the hips unloaded to landing, is when you should be getting that eversion. But Castillo is a good example of kind of holding that ground with the back foot, stable ankle, and if you draw a line from the heel through the knee, that's a good indicator of if you're keeping that ankle stability through the linear portion of the throw. Again, overall love Devin Williams' mechanics, but that is one thing to be aware of is that early eversion, and that does seem to lead towards a little bit of a leaping action off his back leg. So he does kind of, there is a little bit of a disconnect here, and so a lot of athletes will kind of try to recover from some sort of disconnect earlier in the throw with a push off or with a leap to try to make up for that. So you'll see that Fernando Rodney doesn't have kind of a leap or a jump to that extent. Same thing with Castillo. Both are a lot more rotational into landing, whereas Devin kind of tries to recover from this early eversion. So again, just wanted to point out, like, not all internal rotation dominant pitchers are necessarily doing it exactly the same way. There's definitely areas of gray for ER and IR dominant lower halves.